The dance of restraint. The next morning, Mrs. Smith walked into the office determined. She had rehearsed it on the drive over, gripping the steering wheel as though force alone could hold her steady. Professional, polished, unmoved. She would not let Sloan unravel her again. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she crossed the lobby, her expression a mask of composure. When she entered the conference room, he was already there, suit pressed, papers in order, posture relaxed. He looked up as she stepped inside, and for the briefest second, their eyes locked. Her breath faltered, but she did not let it show. She slid into her chair, smoothing her skirt, opening her notes with practiced calm. The meeting began. Colleagues filtered in, their voices filling the room. Sloan presented projections, his voice low and commanding. She contributed where necessary, her tone crisp, her words efficient. On the surface, it was nothing more than business. But beneath the surface, every time his eyes lingered, she felt it. Every time his hand moved across the table, she noticed. Every time his voice dipped lower, slower, her body betrayed her with a subtle quickening of breath. Once, he leaned close to point out a revision in her notes. His arm brushed against hers, so lightly it could have been ignored. She didn't move, neither did he. The brush lingered a second too long. Her pen slipped in her grip, clattering softly against the paper. She picked it up quickly, hiding the tremor in her hand. The rest of the day unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. In the halls, they passed with polite nods. In the break room, they exchanged clipped words over coffee. In the elevator, silence hung heavy between them, neither speaking, neither stepping closer, but both acutely aware of the space they did not cross. By late afternoon, Mrs. Smith felt frayed at the edges. Her professional mask held, but just barely. She had smiled, spoken, strategized, but inside she was burning. When she returned to her office, she closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body ached with the restraint of the day, every nerve alive, every thought circling back to him. She whispered his name once, quietly, as though the walls themselves might betray her. Sloan. The sound of it was a sin in itself. The break. The office had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the city outside the glass walls. Mrs. Smith lingered at her desk, reviewing notes she could no longer read, her pen tapping nervously against the paper. A knock at the door startled her. She looked up, heart leaping. Sloan stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "I thought you'd gone home," he said. "I was finishing up." Her voice was steady, though her pulse betrayed her. He moved closer, not to her desk but to the window, gazing out at the skyline lit in gold and silver. "This city never sleeps," he murmured. "Always moving, always hungry." She swallowed, setting her pen down. "Like you." He turned, a slow smile curving his lips. "Perhaps." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She should have dismissed him, told him she had work, told him to leave. Instead, she rose from her chair, the movement deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she crossed the space between them. "Mr. Sloan," she began, but her voice broke on his name. He closed the distance with a single step, his presence overwhelming, his eyes locked on hers. "Sloan," he corrected gently. And then the air gave way. His mouth found hers, firm and unyielding, and the restraint of days shattered in an instant. She gasped against him, her hands clutching at his lapels, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly as though she weighed nothing at all. The kiss deepened, desperate, hungry, the kind that stripped away words and left only truth. Her body pressed against his, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, reason flickered, her mind whispering of Charles, of duty, of the danger in what she was doing. But the whisper drowned beneath the roar of need, the ache that had built for too long. When they broke apart, both were breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his voice low, roughened. "Tell me to stop." She closed her eyes, trembling. "I can't." That was all he needed. His hands slid lower, tracing the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against him. Her nails dug into his shoulders as his lips found her neck, her jaw, her mouth again. The world outside the glass disappeared. There was only him, only her, only the inevitable fire they had both tried to deny. And in that stolen moment, Mrs. Smith knew two truths at once. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and she had never felt more alive. The break. His mouth found hers, firm and unyielding, and the restraint of days shattered in an instant. She gasped against him, her hands clutching at his lapels, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly as though she weighed nothing at all. The kiss deepened, desperate, hungry, the kind that stripped away words and left only truth. Her body pressed against his, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, reason flickered, her mind whispering of Charles, of duty, of the danger in what she was doing. But the whisper drowned beneath the roar of need, the ache that had built for too long. When they broke apart, both were breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his voice low, roughened. "Tell me to stop." She closed her eyes, trembling. "I can't." Silence followed, thick, dangerous, electric. Then, as if the universe itself conspired to remind them of the line they'd crossed, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the hall. Sloan pulled back just enough to let her breathe, his hand still firm at her waist. Mrs. Smith stepped away quickly, smoothing her blouse, her pulse still rioting. She avoided his eyes, terrified of what he might see, and of what she already knew was written all over her face. The footsteps passed. The hall went silent again. Neither of them spoke. At last, Sloan reached for the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. His voice was soft, threaded with something that was neither apology nor regret. "This isn't over." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone with the taste of him still on her lips and the impossible truth burning in her chest. Mrs. Smith sank into her chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. She had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. "Mrs. Smith's night." The house was dark when she slipped inside, the quiet pressing against her like a weight. Charles was already asleep, sprawled across the bed in his usual position, one arm tossed over the blanket as though the world itself was nothing to carry. Mrs. Smith stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him breathe. Once, the sight of him had been comfort enough. Tonight, it only made her feel hollow. She moved quietly through her routine shower, silk nightgown, brushing her hair with practiced strokes. But every motion felt foreign, disconnected. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her lips were still swollen from the kiss. She touched them lightly, shuddering at the memory of Sloane's mouth against hers, the way he had held her, the raw inevitability of it. Guilt surged immediately after, a sickening twist in her stomach. She had betrayed Charles. Not fully, not yet, but enough to know that the boundary had been crossed. She slid beneath the sheets, turning her back to her husband, her body trembling. His steady breathing was both a shield and a sentence, an unspoken reminder of everything she was risking. But when she closed her eyes, it wasn't Charles she saw. It was Sloan. His hand at her waist, his breath against her lips, his voice, soft but certain, "This isn't over." Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams she couldn't admit, even to herself. Sloane's rules. Across the city, Sloan sat at his bar counter, another untouched rose resting in a vase beside him. The whiskey in his glass went warm before he finally lifted it, letting the burn chase away the silence. He had broken his own rule tonight. He never initiated. He never crossed the line first. He let women come to him, make the choice, shoulder the weight of it. That was his way of keeping the game clean, of staying in control. But with Mrs. Smith, control had slipped. He could still feel her lips on his, the way she melted into him despite her restraint. He could still hear the tremor in her voice when she whispered, "I can't." It hadn't been surrender, it had been admission. Sloan leaned back, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. She wasn't like the others. Nicole's referrals, the women who whispered his name like a secret code, they had all followed a pattern, predictable, temporary, disposable. He played his role, left his rose, moved on. But Mrs. Smith unsettled him. She was power and vulnerability in the same breath, a woman accustomed to being obeyed, yet starved of being seen. She made him want to linger, to push past his carefully built boundaries. And that was dangerous. Because women like her didn't just walk into your life for a night. They walked in to stay, or to ruin you. Sloan finished his drink in one long swallow, setting the glass down hard enough to crack the silence. He told himself he could stop. That tonight had been a mistake, a slip he could walk away from. But even as he made the vow, he knew it was a lie. Mrs. Smith wasn't just another adventure. She was a fire, and he had already struck the match. The distance. Charles noticed. It wasn't much at first, just the way she stared longer into the mirror while getting ready, the way she returned home distracted, her smile delayed when he asked about her day. But even in his distracted state, eyes glued to his phone, Charles wasn't blind. One evening, as she set the table, he finally spoke. "You've been different lately." Her hands froze on the silverware. Different. He shrugged, dropping his phone beside his plate. Quieter, distant. Her pulse quickened. She forced a laugh that sounded brittle to her own ears. "It's the merger, stress, you know how it is." Charles studied her for a moment, as though trying to see past her words. Then he nodded, too easily. "Yeah, stress." He picked up his phone again, conversation closed. But his eyes lingered a moment too long, and she felt the chill of suspicion settle between them. Nicole's game. Across town, Sloane's phone buzzed with Nicole's name. Again. He let it ring twice before answering. "You're avoiding me," she teased, her tone sweet but edged. "Busy," he said simply. "Too busy for me." She laughed softly, but it wasn't the laugh he remembered. It was sharper, probing. "Word gets around, Sloan. You've been occupied." His jaw tightened. Nicole had always been more than a referral source. She was a gatekeeper, a collector of secrets. And if she was sniffing, it meant whispers were already circling. "You know me," he said lightly, masking the tension. "Business first." But even as he said it, he knew she didn't believe him. "Careful," she purred. "One wrong step, and business and pleasure stop being separate." The line went dead before he could reply. Sloan set the phone down, his mind churning. Nicole was dangerous, not because of what she knew, but because of what she might say, and if she turned her eyes toward Mrs. Smith. That thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Cracks in the merger. The merger itself was beginning to show strain. Tensions rose between departments, loyalists clashing with newcomers, egos jostling for position. Mrs. Smith found herself in the middle of it, chairing meetings that felt more like battlegrounds. Sloan was calm as always, his voice cutting through arguments with measured precision. But she saw it, the slight tightening at his jaw, the way his pen tapped once against the table when the bickering dragged too long. She admired it, that control. She envied it. But it also terrified her, because she knew firsthand how quickly that control could break. And every time their eyes met across the boardroom, every time silence lingered a second too long, She wondered how much longer before everything, her marriage, her career, her carefully constructed world, fractured like the merger threatening to collapse around them. Cracks at home. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Charles pushed his fork across his plate, not eating, his eyes fixed on her instead of his phone for once. The intensity of it made Mrs. Smith's stomach tighten. Finally, he spoke, "Is there someone else?" The question landed like a slap. Her throat closed. "What?" "I asked if there's someone else," he repeated, his voice even but sharp. "You're distracted. You're different. You come home late, you hardly talk to me. I may not say much, but I'm not blind." Her pulse raced. Denial rose to her lips, but the guilt burned too hot beneath her skin. She forced composure into her voice. "It's the merger, Charles. Stress, that's all." His eyes searched hers, as if looking for cracks. After a long silence, he nodded slowly, but his expression told her he didn't believe her. For the rest of the night, he barely spoke. But his silence was no longer neglect, it was suspicion.